So today we're jumping into a theological text that draws some incredibly sharp and precise lines when it comes to faith. We're talking about Mufid al-Mustafid. We're going to break down its core framework based on a lecture by Sheikh Ahmed al-Hazmi to really get a handle on its very specific definitions of what constitutes belief and what constitutes disbelief. Let's dive right in.
So, the big question this book really tries to answer is a massive one. Where exactly do you draw the line between a believer and a disbeliever? In this explainer, we're going to unpack the exact methodology this text uses to draw that line, piece by piece.
All right, here's our game plan. First, we're going to start at the very beginning, the purpose of creation itself. Then, we'll look at the specific conditions that define who is a Muslim. After that, we'll tackle the absolute core concept of Takfir. That's the act of declaring someone a disbeliever and the strict method behind it. And to wrap up, we'll explore the different categories of disbelief this text lays out.
Okay, Section 1. Look, before we can even talk about disbelief, we have to understand the foundation of belief. According to the source material, everything, and I mean everything, starts with one single core purpose for all of existence.
The entire argument of the text is built on this one verse from the Quran, and the key word here is accept. The takeaway is that the purpose of our existence isn't just part of a bigger picture, it is the picture. It's only about worship. This singular, unwavering focus is what drives every other definition that follows.
So this purpose of worship gets a name, Tawhid, or pure monotheism. But here's the thing, according to this text, it's not a one-step process, it's a two-sided coin. On one side, you have the affirmation, worshiping God alone. But just as important, on the other side is the rejection, actively disbelieving in and turning away from any other thing that's worshipped, which is referred to as tagut. You gotta have both.
So if that pure monotheism is the foundation, how does this framework define who is actually on that foundation? Who is a Muslim? Well, the source gives us a really specific three-part checklist. It's not a buffet. You have to take all three.
Okay, so this is crucial. All three of these have to be met. It starts with step 1, the verbal declaration of faith. But that's not enough on its own. That leads to step 2. You have to actually act on what you just said. And finally, step 3, you must avoid any action that is considered a nullifier, something that cancels out your Islam. It's presented as a complete package. And this is where things get really black and white. According to this framework, there is no gray area, no middle ground. If you fail on even one of those three conditions, you're not just a bad Muslim or a struggling Muslim. No, you fall completely outside the definition of a Muslim and into the category of a disbeliever or kafir. All right, this brings us to the absolute core of the book, and frankly, its most controversial topic, Takfir, the act of declaring someone to be a disbeliever. The source argues that before you can even have this conversation, you absolutely have to understand the difference between judging an action and judging a specific person.
Now, this slide is key to understanding the whole thing. On the left, you've got general takfir. This is like making a general rule. For example, saying, worshiping an idol is an act of disbelief. It's a ruling on the type of action. But on the right, you have specific takfir. This is when you apply that general rule to a specific person. For example, Zayd, because he worshipped that idol, has become a disbeliever. The source argues that the entire point of Mufid al-Mustafid was to lay out the rules for this second, incredibly serious type of judgment.
So if these judgments are so heavy, so serious, where does the authority to make them even come from? What's the rule book? Well, that takes us to the methodology, and the source establishes a very, very strict hierarchy of authority.
In this framework, the answer is crystal clear. All rulings, all judgments have to come from one of two places, and only these two places, the Quran and the Sunnah, the traditions of the Prophet. These two are considered infallible, the final word, the ultimate source of truth. But you might be wondering, well, what about all the famous scholars throughout history? The lecture is very specific about this. The works of scholars are incredibly valuable for understanding the law, but they are not a source of the law itself. Their opinions are human, they can be wrong, and they must always, always be checked against the Quran and Sunnah. They're like expert commentators, not lawmakers.
All right, in our final section, we're going to see how the text basically performs an autopsy on the concept of disbelief, or kufr. It isn't treated as just one big, simple idea.
Instead, it's broken down into different categories, and each one has very different implications.
So here's another critical split. You have major disbelief, kufr gar. These are the big ones, the acts that break those three conditions we talked about earlier. These are the nullifiers that actually expel a person from Islam. On the other hand, you have minor disbelief, kufr asghar. These are still considered huge sins, but they don't, by themselves, kick you out of the religion.
The source then drills down even further. It says that this major disbelief, the kind that nullifies your faith, actually comes in 5 distinct types. You can think of these as 5 different paths that, according to this framework, lead a person right out of Islam.
So let's quickly run through them. First is the kufr of denial, which is just flat out calling the message a lie. Second is the kufr of pride, and this is a big one. You know the truth is the truth, but your arrogance stops you from accepting it. Third is the kufr of doubt, which means a fundamental lack of conviction in the basics of the faith. Fourth is the kufr of aversion, which is when someone just completely turns their back on the religion, not wanting to learn it or practice it. And finally, the kufr of hypocrisy, looking like a believer on the outside, but hiding disbelief on the inside.
And all of this brings us to one final, really deep question to think about. The source lecture emphasizes that some religious texts are crystal clear, while others are ambiguous. So how does that very distinction between what is considered clear and what is considered ambiguous, how does that fundamentally change how someone interprets Scripture, and ultimately how they make the kind of profound judgments we've been talking about today? It's a question that really gets to the heart of this whole approach.